So I'm here with Sherry and Michael to talk about the next letter of our ongoing conversation about meditations on the tarot. Today we're here to talk about letter 5, which is on the Pope. Sherry, do you want to show the image for us as like you did the last time?
Are we on the three people screen or the one person at a time?
It should be. It shows 3 people on my screen. Let's hope that it's
Because I have to talk while I hold it up or nobody gets to see it.
right. So that's the image.
There it is.
Thank you, Sherry.
Pope.
So does anyone have like any like opening remarks that like something that just wanted like immediately wanted to observe like kind of about the this letter overall, or something that some particular thing that stood out?
There's something in this letter to offend everybody.
Oh wow, what a great way to start the conversation. Please elaborate, Michael. Go for it.
Well, I mean, he gets in all kinds of stuff that will initiate any number of red flags. For instance, I mean, not for me, but for other people. So
Right.
when he gets into papal authority, red flag for Protestants, gets into reincarnation, red flag for lots of people, Christians in particular. What else does he? Well, he does some straight up gendered typology, which is anathema to a lot of people these days. Though it wasn't that controversial when he wrote it.
Right. It's not. I mean, it was he wrote it in like the 70s, so it's not. It's not like that old.
Probably this one. He probably wrote this around 65, 66. I'm guessing.
Yeah, I think it didn't see publication until 1980, though. Is that right?
85 80 right. In German, 85 in English. Yeah.
Right.
What else does he get into that would piss people off? And there's a lot of stuff in here.
Yeah. So yeah, definitely. With the reincarnation thing, it's interesting. It's like he doesn't go into great detail about that, and he does reference the reincarnation a little bit in the previous chapter too. On the Emperor, and I don't think Sherry and I actually talked about that part, because the way he presents reincarnation is like it's an experience. It's if it's either a fact for you, or it's beyond your experience and doesn't have any meaning to you. So
I made a wide around it because I don't understand it, and I'm kind of hoping that it gets fleshed out over time. I don't
think he's not going to, because he's telling you it's not the kind of thing. It's, well, first of all, in this chapter, he says that it's not he says that reincarnation is only a result of the fall, and that it's not an ideal state, which it isn't even and he points out that's not even the goal of Buddhism is to end the cycle of reincarnation, right? So it's not an ideal. But what he says for it is for those who have had the experience of being reincarnated, it's simply a fact of it's a fact of their experience. So it's not something that's open to being debated, because either you have the experience of having been reincarnated or you haven't.
Yeah.
And this is important. This is important because like he's establishing that your subjective inner experience of reality is as important as the objective view. That's why he can view it that way.
Right.
So it's like you don't get to there's no point in us questioning the direct experience of someone who has the experience of having been reincarnated. Like it doesn't do us any good to interrogate that.
Traditionally, though, isn't reincarnation something you don't know you've had? You don't know that you've been reincarnated?
Well,
in like Hinduism or whatever?
No, there's actually lots of reports in India and in other parts, actually not just in India. You have people in America that report memories of past lives. This is a thing that happens. And for those people who have those memories and actually have those experiences,
Yeah.
Tomberg's saying it's like you can't just it's universal. It happens all over the world. There are people that have these experiences, people that have memories of their past lives. It's for him, it's not up for debate. It's their experience. It's a fact. And it's just a matter of then what becomes important for him is like, do we interpret this in a way that glorifies God or in a way that doesn't? And he talks about that more in chapter 4 in the Emperor, and we kind of skipped over that bit, but that's what's important for him is what meaning do you give to it? Does the meaning of it glorify God or not?
And I think you can compare it to after death experiences in a way.
Right.
People have those experiences.
Yeah.
And they come
true.
back and you're going to say, well, no, you weren't really doing that. That was just a psychological thing.
Right.
What are you going to do?
Right.
You know?
Right. Exactly. And
tell me I didn't experience what I experienced.
Right. Which is how we keep which is a good way for us to keep ourselves spiritually blind if we continue to do that. Like, it's like you have to like, that's really like that's like kind of like the core of what this entire book is about, is that we have to take those first person experiences of spiritual reality seriously, and that they have just as much weight as our sense experience of the phenomenal world that we normally experience. I mean, that's like, I mean, I don't see if I honestly, if you can't accept that, then I don't think there's much for you to get out of this book at all. Because that seems like the core of everything is him pointing in that direction. Like, you really have to, like, that's what he's trying to get you to connect to.
Well, can I read the first paragraph again? Just
absolutely. Let's do it.
Okay, dear unknown friend, the card, the Pope, puts us in the presence of the act of benediction. It is essential to have this in mind when one undertakes the interpretation not only of the structure of the whole card, but also of each of its particular elements. One should therefore never lose from sight that in the first place, it is a matter of benediction and everything associated with it. No matter who the Pope may be, or who the acolytes kneeling before him are, and no matter what the two columns behind the Pope signify, and no matter what his tiara and the triple cross he is holding symbolize. What is benediction? What is its source and its effect? Who has the authority to bestow benediction? What role does it play in the spiritual life of humanity? Just wanted to read that as an intro.
Yeah, I would just like a little bit further down, he puts a really nice fine point on it. When we're talking about like what benediction is, he says it is the putting into action of divine power, transcending individual thought and will of the one who is blessed, as well as the one who is pronouncing the blessing. In other words, it is essentially a sacerdotal act.
Yeah. And then it's just jam-packed.
So benediction is like always involves a transcendent will.
Yeah, and I mean, just right after that, he says that it's an ascending in the Kabbalah. It's an ascending and a descending.
Mm-hmm.
I thought it was interesting that he goes from there. He goes right into the whole idea of prayer as respiration.
Yeah,
because in many traditions, prayer is actually respiration. It's an in-breathing and an out-breathing, right? Like the Jesus prayer comes to mind.
Right.
In yoga, right? It's all about breathing.
Yeah. Exactly.
Yeah, he says there are two kinds of respiration: horizontal respiration, which takes place between outside and inside, and vertical respiration, which takes place between above and below. The sting of death, or the essential crisis of the supreme agony, is the abrupt passage from horizontal for vertical respiration. And then he goes on to explain about how the practice of prayer is part of what it does is that it prepares you to take away that sting of death, because you've accustomed yourself to spiritual breathing. So you've learned to die before you die.
Yeah, and something you said, Nate, reminds me of Bulgakov's book on economy. What's the name of the word? I can't remember the exact title, but he talks about our economies now are based on death.
Yeah.
He looks forward to the future of a sociological economy that would be based on life.
Mhm.
And Tomberg does a similar thing here on page 101 when he says, true effort of the will, that is 100% effort, true work, is also a prayer. When it is
Yeah.
intellectual work, it is prayer. Hallowed be thy name. When it is creative effort, it is prayer. Thy kingdom come. When it is work with a view to supplying for the material needs of life, it is prayer. Give us this day our daily bread. And all these forms of prayer in the language of work have their corresponding benedictions or graces.
Yeah, that's really.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, and today was actually a good day when I was out doing my work this morning on the farm, because it's sunny for a change.
Yeah,
and
right.
it's not cold. So I could, and it was really beautiful to be outside. And you'll be proud of me, Sherry. I have lambs now.
What? You have? Oh, cool.
Got a couple lambs, and they follow me all over the place.
Oh,
Michael had 2 little lambs. They do every time I go out. It's the guy with the bottles. Let's go. And but because what we do here, and what you do, Sherry, I'm sure, is it's a sociological economy. It's a sociology of work.
Yeah.
Which is, bring, I hope, at least that's the intention, is to bring benediction.
Yes.
Along with it, right? And healing. I just gave a course last weekend on biodynamic farming and gardening as Christian path. And that was kind of one of the themes is, this, once you have this understanding or realization that you have this kind of that in fact, Keith even touches it on here, that the blood of Christ touching the earth,
Yes,
Golgotha, transforms the earth, and that in a way, as a farmer, you're working with that energy. You kind of have an obligation to treat it in a sacred manner.
Exactly. That's what I was thinking when you were talking about it. Like, I was thinking about how, going up to do my chores is not like going to the office. I don't leave my work behind when I walk away from it, right? Like, and it's a sacred act. So I actually feel like I need to go. Like, if I'm not feeling well and I can't do chores, I feel a little bit less somehow.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's one of the things that, people will bring up when you start talking, like you talked about Bulgakov's idea of economy. And like one of the things that people will say in defense of the way that we practice our agriculture is that, well, how will we feed everybody? And the reality is that we have an insufficient amount of labor dedicated to agriculture. Like, why do we think that it's a good
Mm-hmm.
that we have freed so much of our population from agricultural labor? Why do we think that's a good thing?
And that's why the Amish refuse to do it.
Right.
Yeah.
And the
Right.
thing is, so the Amish, there's an Amish community. There's a new one just a few miles away from my house, and there's another one I do a lot of business with. Those communities are flourishing, not just financially, but they all have 8 or 10 kids, right? So, and if it's some of the places, it's beautiful during haying season, for instance. You can drive through Amish country, you can see them all out there with scythes, and putting up ricks of hay, stooks and then ricks. And it's just so cool to watch because they're all out there, might be 20 or 30 people working a field. And they're doing it because I mean, for many reasons, but one thing it does is it strengthens the bonds of community,
Yes.
right?
Yeah.
Right.
And
Which
the
I
bond,
think contributes to a spirit of flourishing.
yeah, and the bond to the earth. Like
Mhm.
this is the other thing. Like when you busy yourself in a nearness to the earth, I mean, this might sound really esoteric, but I'm just going to say it anyway. There's an exchange of energy there. The closer you are, right? And both parties benefit. The earth and you benefit from that exchange of energies. Joel Salatin once said, "All the microbes in me call out to the microbes in the earth," you know.
True.
And I think of
Mm.
that often. I think of that often, right? Because we are not just spiritually, but physically connected to what's in there. And we do have, there's a sameness to us, you know, to the earth and to the human being. And that communion is beneficial in ways that we don't see, I guess, what I'm
It's
trying to.
work that allows you to breathe, right? I mean, especially let's connect it directly to what we're talking about in the chapter, which is this idea of spiritual respiration. It allows you to breathe, both like physically, you can breathe better. You're in the open air, you know, you're in the country, you're able to breathe like physically, but also it gives you more space for spiritual breath as well because of its openness. Whereas, I mean, think of the claustrophobic life of the cubicle worker.
Yeah.
I mean, which is a constraint in breathing both physically
Right.
because of that claustrophobic quality and spiritually.
Mhm, mhm.
So
And notice that how at the bottom of this page I just quoted from, he lists the 3 levels of horizontal respiration
Yeah.
as love of nature, love of one's neighbor, and love of the beings with the spiritual hierarchies.
right. Yeah.
And then the 3 stages of vertical respiration as purification, illumination, and mystical union.
Yeah.
Right. So, and I like that. I mean, he likes this diagram of the vertical and the horizontal, right?
Yeah.
He does it a lot through this
A lot.
book,
A lot.
you know, and so and so that means the cross permeates everything, right? The cross is not just the symbol and vessel of redemption, but it's and it's a metaphysical principle of the universe
Mhm.
in this way, right? And that if you don't have, I mean, we live in a culture that, you know, if anything, concentrates on the horizontal,
Mhm.
right? And it doesn't really do that very well, but and totally ignores the vertical. But what, you know, the horizontal without the vertical is only half of life.
Right. Right.
It's only half of creation.
Right.
Yeah. Well, I mean, if you don't have the vertical, you're not being purified, illuminated, right? Or experiencing any kind of revelation, which is what you get through mystical union. So how can you actually understand the other 3, the horizontal ones, right? The love of nature, the love of one's neighbor. How can you truly understand what that means if you don't have the other transcendent principles?
Well, the other thing that's obvious that, like, you know, is that we've cut ourselves off from half of our senses, right? So it's like we still use our, and I think that has something to do with our being limited to the horizontal plane. That because basically without being disconnected from our spiritual senses, we have no awareness of the vertical at all. We only can see the horizontal.
Well, it's a scientific materialism, right?
Right, exactly. So
Yeah.
because we rely only on our phenomenal senses.
Mhm.
So without opening up to our spiritual senses of imagination, inspiration, and intuition, then the vertical plane just isn't even, or the vertical plane isn't even there.
Seriously. Yeah, I
So-
mean,
There's a-
you know, because people, I kind of was born with a sensitivity to things. I can call them spiritual or even other forces. I remember one time when I was a fledgling Waldorf teacher, I was helping this guy. I was his assistant. I was helping him prepare a physics demonstration for the next day at school with using magnets. And what you do, you'd have these magnets, you put them under a sheet of paper and drop some iron filings over them. You can see how the radiations of the magnets do their thing. And I remember we're doing this and I'm going, whoa, do you feel that? Because I could, they were actually literally mesmerized.
Right. Yes.
That's what they used to do with magnet therapy. And I
Right,
could
right.
feel it, and my friend could not feel it at all. I said, he goes, what's Michael, you sensitive or something? I said, I guess so. But even more than that, do people, how many people feel a sense of the sacred in certain spaces, like a church, for instance, or you know what I mean?
Or out in
even
nature.
the presence of evil.
Yeah.
Right.
How many people don't do that?
Yeah.
I think there are a lot. I think a lot of people. I think more people experience it that don't experience. But what happens is that we have a cultural pressure that makes people want to deny that because people look at you like you're crazy, and and
True.
because so the culture, like, so in the conversation I had with Michael, like, that we didn't record during lunch the other day, I gave this example, like this, of the kind of the way our age takes something that isn't necessarily crazy and makes it crazy because of how we force it to be expressed. So let's take, for example, a young person who has convinced themselves that they're a deer person, right? Which is a thing that people do in our age. Why do they feel like that the way to express that is in this material way, to try to, like, make themselves look like a deer and act like a deer and express it in this material, in this very material way, where they want everyone to treat them as a deer? What they're experiencing, the connection that they feel to the spirit of the deer, is real. They're experiencing like a shamanic reality of connection to the spirit of the deer. And the only way that our culture allows them to express this is in this twisted material way, because of our denying of the vertical plane. So that the possibility never occurs to this person. So a lot of what we see in, like, these kind of disordered expressions we have are actually a direct result of our culture giving no proper space for the expression of those things.
Well, they're trying to have an experience of the sacred and they don't know how to do it. So it's expressed in a kind of perverted way.
Right.
Well, I'm kind of thinking there's a correlation to our actual development as creatures. We're born into the world and we're basically horizontal, right, for a year. And then we crawl around on the floor for another, few months. And then we become vertical, right? So there's kind of a correlation between this lack of transcendence, this verticalness, and childishness, not childlikeness, but childishness, right? You're just crawling around on the floor. And you don't know, when you stand up, the world is a completely different place.
So are you saying that we were, as a species, in our adolescence?
No, I would say more like babyhood.
Well, no, I think it's neither one of those. I think it's that our culture infantilizes people.
Well, that's
right.
That's what I think.
It doesn't just, and it's the kids they're kind of symptomatic of this greater phenomenon in the world. I noticed it 20 years ago, 30 years ago, when there was this kind of cool movie rental place I would go to before Netflix and all that stuff. And they had really cool art films that nobody had, but they also had a big section of graphic novels and comic books. Right. And I remember I'd go home. So it was almost 30 years ago. I'd go home and I keep ripping on people who were in the comic book section to my wife. It's like, it's weird because, here's all these grownups looking at comic books. And on the other hand, you have all these kids trying to act like grownups. It's bizarre. It's right. And in fact, around that time, I saw a show on Hasidic culture in New York, and one of the guys they talked to said well, it's, we don't understand your world. Because in your world, there's no difference really between a child and an adult. Children and adults do the same things.
Yes.
That's not how we are in our culture. We think there's something sick there.
Yeah.
Yeah, totally.
And it's true. I mean, one of the principles in Waldorf education is, you never, ever give a child, first of all, you don't make them privy to adult conversation. And the other thing is you don't give them decision-making power.
Yeah.
Which we're not there. I mean, just look at what's going on in schools today. It's just not like you, right? Not only are they given decision-making power, but they, and then because they're really not mature enough to handle it, they pull off some disastrous things. It's especially what's happening with teachers grooming young people in schools.
What was that novel? The name's escaping me now, but the novel of all the boys on the island, the famous
Lord of the Flies.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's children given decision-making power.
Yeah. It is.
It's brutal.
And it even goes, to just something as simple as breakfast. What do you want today for breakfast, Bobby?
Yeah.
Really? Would you like oatmeal or you want Fruit Loops? What do you? I don't like that. Unless, and the Waldorf thing is when even Waldorf people just, we're having oatmeal today.
Yes. Yeah.
Right.
Okay, you take and the kids don't need those decisions. They don't need to make those decisions.
It actually unsettles them.
It does.
That's why they get upset, because they need boundaries. They need to be.
And they need to know who the grown-ups are. I mean, that's, of course, it's simply dangerous as well, right? But
yeah,
they need but I think he gets into that in here.
He does, because one of the things he talks
authority,
about,
right?
I talked about obedience as being obedience, chastity, and poverty as being the universal disciplines that basically go across all traditions
but I
that allow you to acquire the 5 wounds.
Yeah, but he doesn't leave them in their traditional context.
No, he doesn't.
Do we want to go there? Because
we should. I mean, we need to talk about, like, the 5 wounds is one of the key. We talked about benediction a little bit. The 5 wounds is one of the other key concepts of this chapter, and that goes alongside with the disciplines that are involved in cultivating the 5 wounds.
Yeah,
so we should probably. Do we want to talk about what we mean when we talk about the 5 wounds first, really quick?
Yeah.
Okay. So when he's talking about the 5 wounds, it's a reference to the wounds of Christ. So you have the hands and the feet bear wounds, and it's actually the 5th wound is surprisingly not the head, because he says that the crown of thorns is universal to humans through all ages. That the crown of thorns simply is objective thought. It's actually the heart.
That is
the wound of the heart, which happens with the piercing of the side.
Mhm.
It is the 5th wound, which he associates with the Sacred Heart. Which is, Sherry? I mean, you're Orthodox, and then before that you were. Do the Orthodox really have the Sacred Heart, or is that just mainly a Catholic and High Church Anglican thing?
I'm going to get baptized on the 22nd of this month.
Yay!
But I have set foot into an Orthodox church once. Everything else was over Zoom.
Really?
I don't have one here. I don't have an Orthodox church here anywhere near me. So I'm going to drive 5 hours one way for my baptism and then home again. And so my journey into Orthodoxy is a little bit different. But
the key idea with the Sacred Heart is that it restores the reason the head is less important is it restores this sort of like Hebraic connection between head and heart,
Yeah,
like, and because they don't operate without each other, right? So the heart has, and humility is the spiritual gift of the Sacred Heart.
there is an icon of Mary with, I think it's five, whatever, pointy things pointing at her.
I'm
heart.
sure there's an Orthodox equivalent of the concept of the Sacred Heart, but
Yeah.
I don't, if there is, I don't know it.
I don't think so.
You don't think so? Okay.
I've never seen it. And I was, been to a Byzantine Catholic church for
Okay.
30 years.
Oh, okay, okay.
Not there.
What
Okay.
is it then? What is it? What is the Sacred Heart?
Do I have one in here? It's famous.
Yeah,
Image of Jesus.
I've heard of it.
I can pull up an image of the icon.
Millions of schools called Sacred Heart. Like there's a Catholic school in town called Sacred Heart.
Yeah, it's actually you probably have seen it, Sherry. It's a very famous
Absolutely.
icon.
Is it the heart with the crown on it? No? Okay.
Um,
Let me
Got
share
it?
my
Got it,
screen.
Nate?
I've got it pulled up. Let me just share screen here. So that's it, guys. That's the Sacred Heart.
Okay.
So
Okay.
and there's a complimentary one of Mary with the Immaculate Heart.
correct.
Maybe that's the one that I'm thinking of in the Orthodox
Well,
icon.
the Orthodox, it's actually it's in reference to Simeon when he tells Mary that and will be pierced by a sword, right?
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yep.
Well, one of the things that I thought was interesting about the wounds was that he correlates them to the senses.
Right. Well, so
They're openings into the interior. Right? A wound is an opening from the exterior, like allows the exterior into the interior, right?
right. So so the 5 wounds of like that he's talking about in relation to the pentagram of sacred magic are the spiritual equivalents thereof.
Right.
But yes, he says that we already as human beings have the 5 wounds, and those are associated with the sensitive, which is what forces the objective world in upon us.
Yeah.
And he says on top of page 111, the 5 wounds corresponding to the 5 dark currents of the will, the desire for personal greatness, to take, to keep, to advance, and to hold on to at the expense of others.
Yeah.
Right.
So the wounds kind of heal those kind of
Right. So these,
animistic
yeah, right.
tendencies,
So
right?
the 5 wounds of the pentagram of sacred magic are the spiritual wounds that correct those things, that nail them. He actually uses nails, right?
Yeah, let me just read that. He says here, the desire to take or get hold of things is bound to the right hand. Similarly, the desire to retain or keep belongs to the left hand. Likewise, the desire to advance at the expense of others and the desire to hold on to at the expense of others correspond to the right foot and the left foot, respectively. But it is not the case concerning the desire for personal greatness that it corresponds to the head. The head does not bear the 5th wound for 2 reasons. Firstly, because it bears the crown of thorns, which is born in principle by every person capable of objective thought. The crown of thorns being given to the human being since the beginning of human history. It is that subtle organ which is designated for us in the Occident as the 8-petaled lotus, which is designated in India as the 1,000-petaled lotus, or Sahasrara, crown center. This crown center is a natural gift, as it were, to each human being, and every normal person possesses it. The thorns of the crown center function as the nails of objectivity, which give conscience to thought. It is thanks to them that thought has not become wholly emancipated and as arbitrary, for example, as the imagination is. Thought as such is, in spite of all, the organ of truth, not of illusion.
And that's what our culture doesn't possess any longer.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. That's why they dress up as a deer. Because they're.
And they think that opinion is truth.
Yeah.
But the reason we got there is by making that everything, by idolizing that. That's how we ended up in this state now. So it's like, so this is so what we're seeing is this, I think what we're seeing is actually signs of sort of an awakening where these spiritual realities are starting to break through again. And you're seeing a lot of confusion because we're still just breaking out of this idolatry of that objective faculty as the only thing that matters.
Right.
Because that's not what Tomberg's saying. He's saying that it's important because it's the thing that allows you to tell truth from illusion. But he also is telling you that imagination is the spiritual sense of sight. So you need objective thought in order to be able to tell truth from illusion, but you will be spiritually blind if you don't know how to use the imagination properly.
Well, that's what
So
happened.
there's a proper relationship between those things.
There is, but what I'm saying is, without the consciousness or the presence of the crown of thorns or the wounds that come in there, then you think imagination is thought.
Right.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Right. That's the post. Yeah, that's right. Precisely. So that's what it's interesting because it's postmodernism. It's interesting because like, so modernity essentially is like, its whole purpose is to kill tradition.
Right.
But it does it by trying to replace tradition with just like with a completely man-centered model where objective thought is actually the only thing that matters. And postmodernity is okay with the attempt of the modern in order to overcome tradition, but it doesn't care for but it feels the objectivity of modernity as oppressive, which basically just means that it wants to open up the spiritual, but it only wants to open it up to the demonic side because it doesn't want to do that in balance with the crown of thorns.
So I have a question. George MacDonald makes the distinction between imagination and fancy. And he gets at that from Coleridge. And I don't know enough about Coleridge. Do you know anything about that, Michael?
Yeah, in Coleridge, fancy is it's more like children playing, you know,
like becoming, like turning yourself into a deer.
Yeah, that's fancy.
Right, that's fancy.
Imagination is a different thing. The imagination, I don't know if it's that, is more like a current, and this is Steiner and Tomberg talks about this, is more a current from the future.
Right.
Yeah. Where it's so for example, I mean, I don't know if this is a good example or not, but you know, Philip K. Dick in his novels and short stories seem to be using imagination to me. Because it really was like the future was coming toward him and he was seeing what was going to happen, right? But he was using the forces of imagination to do that. Right. Whereas fancy is like those kids pretending they're deer, or even you could say some political expression, you know, contemporary political expressions are based on fancy. Yeah. I had a student, for instance, this semester, really smart student. She wrote 2 really great papers, and she had to write a 3rd paper, and it was on feminism and how everybody needs feminism. But she didn't, and she was really smart. So when I could actually critique her, she said, "Oh yeah, you're right," which is not always the case in these kind of papers. But I told her, you know, because she just dropped all these, you know, cultural assumptions about what women are, what feminism is, and what gender is, and I said, I can't just take your word for this. You got to show me why that's true. Right. I see what you're saying. You know, and in fact, what she had to present and since she was doing this thing on feminism, I said, so, a lot of problems, kind of old school feminists are having is now you have transgendered females trying to say that they they're women and they need the rights of women and stuff like this. But these kind of traditional feminists are saying, no, have a period, then you can be a woman, right?
Yeah.
And I said, so what do you think about that? And she said, well, we all know that gender is on a spectrum. And all I said was, do we?
Yeah.
Do we? I mean, why do we say that? Because we haven't thought that one through, right?
Yeah. Well, it's interesting because
to me, that's the irony with that is it's so weird that is thought to be so, that thought is so widespread and so accepted in our culture today. But one of the great challenges that no one has ever actually pulled off in speculative fiction is to actually invent a species that has a third gender that makes any coherent sense. So how can both of those things be true? How could it be almost impossible for even our fiction writers to imagine a third gender functioning in a fictional realm in a convincing way?
Yeah.
And yet we accept that gender is a spectrum.
Well, there is the child of Hermes and Aphrodite, the hermaphrodite, right? Who had qualities of both.
But it's just a combination of the two. Exactly.
Right.
There's no third thing.
No, there is no other.
And that spectrum, and their spectrum is just a slider bar of the two.
There is no, in Brave New World, it's my favorite word from Brave New World, free Martin. There's the free Martins where the technological, the medical process by which they're supposed to create a male or a female goes wrong, and they come up with this person who is neither, and they're sterile, and nobody knows what to do with them, but they blow it off.
Right.
But also in classical mythology, Tiresias, right, who spends I don't know how long he finds these snakes mating and he uses his staff to get them to cut it out. Like a nun at a high school dance, and then as his punishment, not his punishment, but he's turned into a woman by doing that, and he lives as a woman for however long, and then he finds snakes again and he touches them and he goes back to being a man. But the point with that story is that because he's done that, he knows what it's like to be a woman.
Right.
I mean, he really was a biological woman. Right. And my friends and I, when we were young men, just starting dating and stuff like that, we would just, we had to figure out that girls were not like us.
Well, and proper
we would speculate, what do girls think like?
Right.
And he talks about it here.
He does. He does. And in fact, if you look eventually toward the end of the chapter, he talks about essentially what you're looking for is a progression from the cross to the pentagram to the hexagram. And in the hexagram, you actually have a masculine and a feminine trinity brought together, which I think he clearly has to be talking about the marriage of spirit and soul there. And the fact that he says the Holy Spirit and the Holy Soul is the Holy Soul respectively as those two trinities is your hint that that's what he's talking about.
And he's on page 114, for instance.
Yeah.
The practice of chastity. And here's what a good word, right? Holds fast the leanings of the hunter in the human being.
Yeah.
Which the male side is inclined to pursue game and the female side to set traps. The practice of poverty binds the tendencies of the thief in the human being, where the male side is inclined to seize and the female side to keep indefinitely, instead of waiting for the free gift of the merited fruit of work. The practice of obedience, lastly, rivets the will to greatness or the inclinations of the usurper in human nature, whose male side is inclined to estimate itself great in its own eyes, and whose female side seeks to make itself estimated so in the eyes of others.
And notice, he's putting this in these 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 gender typographies, but those traits you will see those traits in persons of both genders. So he's not saying it may in fact be more characteristic of women than men, but all of these faults are found in members of both genders.
Yeah, don't apologize though. Like seriously, there are, the stereotypes aren't that off. Like
No, I'm actually not apologizing. I'm actually trying to make an important point, which I think when you get to the idea of the hexagram becomes pretty obvious, is
Yeah.
that's part of what the confusion is in our age, is that you have both elements
Yeah.
as a human being.
Yeah.
Right.
Okay. Go ahead, Mike.
There was a book, only read one sentence in it. It was all I needed. I think it was called Raising a Son or Raising a Daughter. And since I've raised a lot of each, and what it said, and I think this is a great advice I used as a teacher when I was a school teacher. And what it said was went something along the lines of, the one thing you need to know about raising boys is that they need to know that you're the authority and you know what you're talking about.
Mm-hmm.
The one thing you need about raising girls is they need to know that you love them and you protect them, which sounds so sexist and everything. But as a teacher, that was my main tool for working with boys and girls.
Yeah.
Because if the girls felt that I was there for them, they could be at ease and they could learn. And the boys, especially when you get to middle school, becomes very obvious. Where'd you read that, Mr. Martin, in a book? And so then they see that you know what you're talking about, and you win the respect, and they want to, I shouldn't say emulate you, but they derive something from that.
Well, they admire you.
And I did it with my own kids.
But here's the thing, though, is that as we know from the previous chapter on the Emperor, that real authority is a species of love.
Yeah. I mean, there's
And on the part of the authority, you don't abuse that situation.
Right.
He's talking about the 5 wounds here, right?
Yeah.
You don't you practice it in humility, or by having received the 5 wounds, you don't do it to grasp or to hold or you know what I mean?
No, you do it.
You're not doing it for yourself.
No, right, exactly. You're doing it for them.
Yeah.
You do it out of love, right? You
Yes.
gain that understanding so that you can better impart, do your job and help them to move forward in the world. Yeah.
So, I mean, that's like, so if there's if you're, that would be the genuine basis of monarchical authority, is the love of your subjects, right?
Well, back to this idea of imagination and fancy. George MacDonald says that if your child is exercising fancy, you should discourage it, right? And back to the modern world, we're encouraging it.
What really distinguishes imagination from fancy, I think, for MacDonald and for Coleridge and for Barfield and for Steiner, is that fancy is arbitrary. Imagination is not arbitrary.
It's divine.
Right.
George.
Imagination is the seeing of the vertical world, exactly, the spiritual world. That's what imagination is.
I get the impression that imagination is the presencing of the real.
Yes.
I would describe.
That's a great way of putting it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, in fact, my mom, as you know, has dementia, and she's in the next room watching The Song of Bernadette, which just happened to be in the DVD player.
I love that movie.
And that's a great example. You see the movie?
Yeah, I love it.
Beautiful movie.
It's wonderful. Yeah.
And Tomberg gets into the Marian visions in the book here, right? And that seems to me her experience of the lady and even of the kids at Fatima. That's imagination.
Yes,
Yeah.
right. And you're
Which is a presencing of the real.
correct. And which is not a derogatory use of imagination at all.
No.
It just means she had eyes to see, is what that means ultimately.
You can tell it's
That's
with what I would call these kinds of authentic, and because people can use fancy to convince themselves that Virgin Mary is talking to them.
right.
It happens both. That's why I think the church has traditionally been kind of, okay, let's slow down when it comes to that stuff.
That's a good point. That's really good. Nice observation, Michael.
And and I think that's important. I mean, because in those, like, both Fatima and Lourdes with Bernadette, the lady doesn't tell her name.
Well, there's also like fancy, like it's like there's a consciousness of the fact that you know that you're pretending, right? Imagination isn't like that. You're using your spiritual sight and reporting what you see.
Right.
This is why Goethe could use his imagination to understand how a leaf becomes a flower.
Because he was seeing it. Right, yes, exactly.
It's the real, right? This is also why Anodos in Phantastes moves into the fairyland. The fairyland is not it's not a fancy, it's the real. He sees things for what they really are.
Right.
Right. But in order for the imagination, I think, to function properly, you have to have those, you have to have the vows, right? Obedience, poverty, and chastity.
Right, exactly right.
Which holds that in check.
Yeah, exactly, which grounds it, right? It's the grounding of the mind, maybe, so that imagination can flourish and fancy can diminish, in a sense, I think.
Very good. No, that's really, really, yeah, spot on.
I just wanted to read the kind of like a little bit from each one of the vows: obedience, poverty, and chastity, because I found these really great. The vow of obedience is the practice of silencing personal desires, emotions, and imagination, which is fancy in this case, in the face of reason and conscience. It is the primacy of the ideal as opposed to the apparent, the nation as opposed to the personal, humanity as opposed to the nation, and God as opposed to humanity. So it has this hierarchical ascension in essence. It is the life of cosmic and human hierarchical ordering. It is the meaning and justification of the fact that there are seraphim, cherubim, thrones, dominions, virtues, powers, principalities, archangels, angels, priests, knights, and commoners. Obedience is order. It is international law. It is the state. It is the church. It is universal peace. True obedience is the very opposite of tyranny and slavery, since its root is the love which issues from faith and confidence. And then poverty, and I found this the most interesting actually for myself. The vow of poverty is the practice of inner emptiness, which is kenosis, right? Which is established as a consequence of the silence of personal desires, emotions, and imagination, which is in this case fancy, so that the soul is capable of receiving from above the revelation of the word, the life and light. Poverty is perpetual active vigil and expectation before the eternal sources of creating. It is the soul awaiting that which is new and unexpected. It is the aptitude for learning always and everywhere. That one really spoke to me, because I've always had this sense that we need to be in the mode of eager anticipation in our lives, right? We have to always be anticipating a gift from the giver, right? And just talking about it now, it seems to me that that's part of the reason why doing my chores is a sacred act, because whenever I do them, I receive something. I receive, I don't know, love from my animals. I receive good health. I receive a revelation sometimes, in my thinking. Or I just get to see something I never saw before, around me. And then the vow of chastity means to say the putting into practice of the resolution to live according to solar law without covetousness, without indifference. Because virtue is boring and vice is disgusting. It's an
There's
interesting.
another one of those offensive lines.
But
He's right.
Yeah.
Please, I just love that part, but continue, please.
But that which lives at the foundation of the heart is neither boring nor disgusting. The foundation of the heart is love. The heart lives only when it loves. It is then like the sun, and chastity is the state of the human being in which the heart, having become solar, is the center of gravity. And then he says further down that it doesn't matter if a person is chaste no matter whether he or she is celibate or married. Thus, there are virgins, quote unquote, who are married and mothers of children, and there are physical virgins who are not so in reality. The ideal of the Virgin Mother that the traditional church, Catholic and Orthodox, puts forward is truly worthy of reverence. It is the ideal of chastity which triumphs over sterility and indifference.
That's actually an idea that you find also in Jakob Burma.
Yeah.
Because he didn't think that Mary was a perpetual biological virgin.
Right, because he was
but
Lutheran.
that her office as Sophia and her purity as a person made her virginal.
Yeah.
So he has a different take on it. So for Burma, when the New Testament says that the brothers of Jesus were there, they were the brothers of Jesus, which is often interpreted as, no, that you see in culture at the time, that could be cousins or guys you knew from the neighborhood.
Right.
Right.
Yeah, I would say that, yeah, that's actually, and I like that too, because I think that especially for Catholics, although for Orthodox too, but Catholics make a bigger deal about it. Like the obsession with the perpetual virginity as being, that makes the perpetual virginity like the root of Mary's holiness. And that's not it.
No, that's not it.
That's not it.
Well,
it's like, maybe I'm kind of, honestly, I'm kind of like agnostic on the question. It's like, maybe not, I don't know. It works for, the point is that Mary's importance, devotional importance, it stands up regardless. Right. It doesn't matter.
But when the monks start calling the shots, they're gonna emphasize whether it makes perfection more like a monk.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. That's true. That's true. There's right
Don't
after.
Even get me going on this topic, dudes.
I'm going to sidetrack you really quickly here, because right after the section, which I also had highlighted, Cherry, that was a great part.
Yeah.
He goes on to say the practice of chastity does not concern solely the domain of sex. It bears equally on all other domains where there is a choice between solar law and all sorts of dulling intoxications. Mm-hmm. Thus, for example, all fanaticism sins against chastity, because there one is carried away by a dark current. The French Revolution was an orgy of perverse collective intoxication, just as the revolution in Russia was. Nationalism, such as in the Germany of Hitler, is likewise a form of intoxication, drowning the conscience of the heart, and therefore incompatible with the idea of chastity.
Yeah.
So that linking of that to chastity, I really liked as well. And just really quickly, he keeps talking about solar law here, and I noticed that he opens this chapter with a quote from Genesis about Melchizedek, and he does talk a little bit earlier in the chapter about Melchizedek. And I know I'm thinking that this seems to be linked to Steiner's idea of Melchizedek as a high priest of the solar mysteries. Is that what he's referencing here, Michael? Do you think?
Okay, John.
It's 103, actually. I wanted, yeah, it's good. Page 103, and it's about the third paragraph from the bottom.
Third
Sorry.
paragraph to the bottom, 103.
Now primordial water
Right.
penetrated by divine breath.
Well, Steiner does talk about that, but also in the Orthodox tradition and, or the Eastern Christianity, Melchizedek is Christ
Right.
from the future, right? Appearing, right? It's got bread and wine, right?
But
So it's a foreshadowing of Christ, but it is Christ.
but Christ also has an association with the Son. Like
Right.
that's, I mean, there's
No,
intentional
but
wordplay all the
Melchizedek-
time between son and son, right? So
Right. And
so
that's
both of those things, I think both of those things are true, actually.
right. But Melchizedek means the King of Peace.
The King of Peace, yeah.
Yeah. The
Mhm,
King of
mhm.
Salem, right?
Well,
But when he's saying solar law, I think what he's talking about here is like, he's talking essentially about like the pre-Christian Christian tradition. He's talking about the solar mysteries,
And actually,
which Melchizedek is a representative of. So it's like Melchizedek is in the world as a priest of the solar mysteries
Most likely.
before Jesus Christ is on earth, right?
Mhm.
Because I mean, the Son of God is eternal, and his presence is always in the world in some way. And and he's making the connection. This is why he's saying solar law. He's connecting it to this idea of the solar mysteries. I'm pretty sure that's what he's doing. He doesn't say. He just assumes you either know or you don't know. But that seems to me to be what he's referencing.
Well, he
And
does. Oh,
He
sorry.
also connects it to the heart, right? That's the solar plexus, the solar mystery. is
Yes,
the heart,
right. Yeah,
Because he talks
right.
about the chakras later.
Right.
I
Yes.
can't remember what
Yes.
letter it is, but that's the whole idea. That's the center. That's
Right.
the center of the Christian, is the heart center, right?
Right.
And the task of the Christian is to turn all the centers, whether it's the solar plexus,
Which connects
or-
back to the idea of Melchizedek as the King of Peace, because essentially, like the heart is where you experience the peace of God. Like that's where it is. It's in the heart.
Right.
That's where you live into that.
Here, let me just read this because this kind of illuminates.
La, la, la.
The heart is the center of respiration and blood circulation. The head is the center of the nervous system and is the seat of thought. Because history, as moreover, the life of the individual is worked, quote unquote, by day and by night. It has a diurnal aspect and a nocturnal aspect. The former is exoteric, while the latter is esoteric. The silence and obscurity of the night is always full of events in preparation, and all that which is unconscious or superconscious in the human being belongs to the domain of the night. This is the magical side of history, the side of magical deeds and works acting behind the facade of history by day. Thus, when the gospel was preached by the light of day in the countries around the Mediterranean, the nocturnal rays of the gospel effected a profound transformation of Buddhism.
It.
Should I keep going?
If you want, yeah, go ahead.
There, the ideal of individual liberation by entering the state of nirvana gave way to the ideal of renouncing nirvana for the work of mercy towards suffering humanity. But anyway, well, I guess the point that I was trying to make was that this idea of night and day and darkness and light and solar mysteries, they're all connected, right?
Yes.
Yeah, because he then says, the emperor of the fourth card is the master of the day and the guardian of the blood, or quintessence of the nocturnal reality of the day. The Pope is the guardian of respiration, or of the reality of the relationship between day and night. That which he guards is the equilibrium between day and night, between human effort and divine grace. His post is founded on primordial cosmic deeds. Thus the first book of Moses says, and God separated the light from the darkness. God called the light day and the darkness he called night. And then he gets into chaos and breath. And then he goes into Melchizedek after that.
That's interesting. What do you guys make of the claim that he's essentially claiming that the possibility for the Mahayana movement within Buddhism
Yeah.
is a secondary effect of the incarnation?
Yes, and I don't. This is actually, I remember this from college, that images of the Buddha didn't even start to appear in Eastern culture until around the time of Christ.
Wow.
So 500 years later, yeah.
So is this?
And here's the other thing. Now, you guys might not know about this, but there is, in some anthroposophical circles, debate about whether or not Valentin Tomberg was himself the, what do they call it, the Maitreya Buddha, the seated Buddha, who because in the Maitreya Buddha you see statues of him or icons. He's in a chair. He's always sitting in a chair, which is not how Eastern people sit. So that's the Western Buddha. And there were books published about it back not long after this came out, because people, Valentin Tomberg is a lightning rod for anthroposophists. They either love him or hate him, and most of them hate him. And there was this suggestion that he was this Maitreya Buddha figure, or this reincarnated Buddha who was there to lead Eastern people to Christ, or to the church, which is what pissed all the anthropops off. But that's part of what you're reading here, and he gets into it later in the book even more.
Okay.
Now, I am not a person who believes that, but it's amazing how many people have gotten vehemently angry about this, or like I think Robert Powell believes that he was.
So it becomes conversionist in its own way, in a sense. Yeah, interesting.
But also, there's another thing in Hinduism around the same time as the life of Christ. The image of the Kalki avatar shows up, who is seated on a white horse, which is directly related to what happens in Revelation, right?
And
so
that's
it's interesting. In fact, when I was at the Waldorf School, we were close to a Hare Krishna temple, a really nice one. And when I first started, there were a lot of Krishna kids there. So I knew a couple parents in my class. One of them was a priestess at the temple. And I remember talking to her about this. She'd grown up Baptist, and she was, a Black inner city Baptist girl who became a Krishna. She said, "Yeah, you know what? I think you're onto something with Kalki and Jesus."
That's interesting, because I think the Bible kind of speaks to this sort of ripple effect of the incarnation. That's what the story of the three kings is.
Oh, okay.
You have like these Gentile astrologers that come and bring gifts to the incarnate Son of God, because they see him for what he is through those ripple effects. Like, they're observing the heavens, they see the signs.
Well, this is like Rupert Sheldrake's morphic fields.
Right. I listened to something the other day that I have no idea about the reliability or the source of it, but it was intriguing. Apparently, like, there's a claim made that one of the early Chinese emperors like made a diary entry in 33 AD that seemed to intuit the meaning of the crucifixion and resurrection.
Well, there's also, there was also that one you probably heard, I can't remember if it's in Pliny, where a sailor hears this voice, and he's in the Mediterranean, and he says, "Great Pan is dead." at the time of the crucifixion.
Right.
And people have debated whether that meant Great Pan was dead, or that whatever voice it was that spoke, witnessing the crucifixion of Jesus, thought he was the Great Pan, which is something that what's the name of that book? Eleanor Fargen writes about in some of her poetry.
Well, I would say that cosmically he kind of is the Great Pan. Like, if you understand, like although like his aspect is very different from Pan, right? So it's Pan independent of the pandemonium.
But Pan was, he's, we hear about all these stories about the gods, but the country people didn't pray to those gods. That was the elite.
Right.
The country people prayed to Pan.
Right.
He was the god of the fields and the animals.
Right.
And that's Eleanor Fargen's take, when basically Pan in her poetry is a cipher for Christ.
Gotcha.
Yeah. There's also there's these two books, Down the Bright Stream and the Little Gray Men. Do you know these books? Children's books written in the 40s, I think, by the author's name is BB, like BB gun, right?
Okay.
And it's about these little, gnomey guys, and they're the last gnomes of Britain. And there's a point where, this one farmer is really wrecking havoc on all the wild animals, these kind of industrial agriculture writ large, the demonic force. And they had the great gathering of the people of the forest, including the animals, to ask Pan to do something about it. Have a great moment. It's cool, but I mean, my kids love those books. My kids love those books.
I'm loving your dog in the background.
Is she? Can you see her? Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, there she is. She's sacked out.
Every now and then she does a big stretch, and then she rolls on her other side. She's just so enjoying that bed.
She's become very attached to me. She wants to be wherever I am.
Oh,
lately.
sweet. Yeah. Yeah.
Now, can we talk about one more thing? And I'm going to have to go in a little bit. I got
Sure.
a ton of work to do.
Yeah.
Purgatory.
Okay.
Go.
So he just equates purgatory with suffering. Ultimately, he talks about limbo and purgatory and paradise, and he talks about how they are actually all things that are within our experience. Let's see if I can find the section.
Well, I got it here. He says,
okay, go for it.
Nature is limbo, human is purgatory, and into the divine is paradise. So he says their practical meaning is not spatial, referring to places, but rather to states of the human being in body, soul, and spirit. And I must admit that I find that much more closer to the way that I think about things. Concerning the experience relating to purgatory, it comprises all purging suffering, physical, psychic, and spiritual. It is corporeal, moral, and intellectual suffering, which is our intermediate state between the experience of the natural innocence of limbo and the moments of heavenly joy when the rays of paradise reach us. We already experience here below a foretaste of purgatory and of paradise. We suffer, and the consolations of heaven are given us. Human life is natural, innocent joy, and its ruin is through sin. What ensues is suffering, and it is the rays of benediction from heaven which console us. This is our life. It consists of experiencing the reality of limbo, purgatory, and paradise. Purgatory includes all sickness and all suffering. To be let out of it signifies liberation from it, i.e., to be healed, illumined, and reunited with the Spirit.
Well, my one thought I have about this is actually connects back to when we were doing the Apocalypse of John by M.L. Boak. and thinking about the way he thought of the Perusia as the rival of the super sensible spiritual world in total,
Crashing in, yeah.
crashing in. And see, if you stop, if you think of that now, think about that in light of this idea that these things are not talking about, they're not spatial references. And you can see why every moment is a potential apocalypse.
Like to me, it's because I think of these things as fractal. It reflects our birth, our childhood, our teenage years, and like the 4 stages of life that Douglas Harding talks about. It reflects that, right? It also reflects what's going on in our interior life, in our lives. And I would also say that it can be spatial, right? Because these things are, like, I just think of it this way: the same story is always being told. It's this story of redemption, right? Is what it's laying out there, and it's always being told, whether it's being told in how you are physically brought into the world and how you develop throughout it, or how you mentally develop throughout it, or how you spiritually develop throughout it, right?
I think when he says they're not spatial, he means they're not horizontally spatial. So he means something that's on the same lines as what Jesus means when he says, "My kingdom is not of this world."
Yeah, totally. Yeah.
So that doesn't mean there's not a spiritual, like true space, right? So
No,
like the kind of space that you would think about when Bach talks about the idea, like in the Parsifal, of time becoming space.
yeah.
That kind where eternity gets involved.
Yeah.
When and you have a true open space.
Yeah.
It's a kind of quantum physics version of multiple spaces at the same time. I also think there's, I mean, what he's describing here with purgatory in particular is the purgatory is a psychological state. Suffering
Yes.
is a psychological state,
Yeah.
right? Even though if it's physical pain, the real pain is the psychological pain associated with that.
Yeah, the feeling of being trapped.
And I always thought that the Tibetan Book of the Dead was the best book ever written on purgatory, because it's all about how our attachments to whatever are actually the cause of our pain in the afterlife, because we're still attached to them. And you hear examples of disembodied spirits who are unquiet because they still are attached to something that they left behind, or they don't know they're dead, or something like that, right? And that and in the Tibetan Book of the Dead, it's all psychological states, and that's why there are instructions when the person is just dying. The priest or whoever it is gives instructions, says, "Okay, first you're going to see the clear light of nirvana. Don't be afraid." But everybody, they assume everybody's gonna be afraid. So since you were afraid of that one, okay, that didn't work out, right? Okay, now you're gonna see blue light. This is the light of God. Don't be afraid. But people get afraid because of they still have their attachments, and it leads them deeper and deeper into these psychological states. It kind of almost like an acid trip, where they kind of just get churned into their own stuff. And but at each moment there's a chance to be liberated from it.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Which
All
is,
these
I mean,
things.
that's the meaning
Book.
of this is the meaning of the harrowing of hell.
Mm-hmm.
It's actually not right to think of that only as applying to the afterlife, though, because these states of like purgatory and hell that we put ourselves through, like they're here on the horizontal plane too.
Mm-hmm.
And that hell is also always being harrowed. In a way, it's out of hell that Christ always redeems everyone.
Right. And I think that's why universalism might discount hell, but they don't discount purgatory.
Right.
Like
Well,
David
that,
Harris.
that, what you were describing from the Tibetan Book of the Dead reminds me of what happens to Lilith at the end of the book, at the end of the story, of her story anyway, where she goes through this, she's at Mara's house, the house of bitter waters, right? Where she has to go through this whole, she's trapped in the house with Adam, and she can't get out, and she's turning into a cat, and she's hissing and scratching and tearing around and hiding, and and then towards the end she has that one thing left in her hand, and he cuts it off, right? And then and she wants to sleep, like she actually has the desire to die, to sleep. That it really reminds me of that, actually, when you describe that. Yeah, interesting. I doubt that George MacDonald read the Tibetan Book of the Dead, but you never know.
I don't think the translation was available yet.
Well, but yeah, we would. I mean, it never surprises me when these ideas like end up, overlapping.
No, it's not surprising at all.
The one last thing I wanted to talk about really quick that I thought was really important in this chapter is he spends some time talking about this idea of the conflict between the ideal and the actual truth, which he describes as being between mercy, hesed, and truth, emeth. And then he associates this with the emperor and the pope. So what do you guys think about this like double truth concept? I think with this also, this has to do with this day-night
Yeah.
part thing that he's talking about too. Do you want me to read it? What I'm talking about?
What
Okay.
page?
Okay. This is page one. It starts on toward the bottom of page 104. I'll just read the parts that I have highlighted. There are therefore two truths. The one is actual or temporal, and the other is ideal or eternal. The first is founded on the logic of facts, the other on moral logic. Now, Psalm 85 designates actual truth, emeth, by the word truth, veritas, and truth based on moral logic, hesed, by the word mercy, misericordia. The Psalm says, mercy, hesed, and truth, emeth, will meet. Justice, tzedek, and peace, shalom, will embrace each other. Truth, emeth, will spring up from the ground, meretz, and justice, tzedek, will look down from the heavens, miskamim. I have no idea. Pronunciation is terrible. I'm sure that Yosef can correct me later. Here is the problem of double truth in its entirety. And here is the moving prophecy of the two truths, the factual and the moral, will at some time meet, and that their revelation in man, justice, tzedek, and peace, shalom, will embrace each other. But they will meet only slowly, and given the actual state of affairs, they often will still contradict one another, at least in appearance. This is why St. Paul has had to say that the wisdom of this world is folly with God. And this is why also divine wisdom is often folly before this world. Now the Pope, being the guardian of spiritual respiration, and the letter He, the fifth letter of the Hebrew alphabet, has breath as its primary hieroglyph, is the representative of moral logic. Benediction and prayer are the two pillars between which he is seated. It is only that which is ideal which is true for him. Here is why for him marriage is indissoluble, though there may be thousands of matrimonial catastrophes. Here is why confession and repentance efface every sin, though thousands of tribunals only punish the guilty, whether they repent or not. Here is why the Church is guided by the Holy Spirit, though it practiced or tolerated the practice of the Inquisition for centuries. And here is why a single life on earth suffices for eternal salvation, though souls reincarnate. Thus the Pope is always at the middle of a conflict between ideal truth and actual truth, between mercy, hesed, and truth, emeth. And this conflict is a wound, namely the fifth wound, the wound of the heart. For if the emperor has four wounds, the Pope has 5. And that's the main section. It goes on from there. But Then he brings up the Sacred Heart immediately after that, which we talked about already.
So the double truth is like the dichotomy between mercy and justice. Is that,
And the ideal and the ideal and the ideal and the factual at the same time.
which is what mercy and justice are about? Mercy is the ideal and justice is the factual, right?
I think so.
I always thought that the abortion debate never has risen to this level of nuance, which is why it's such a darn mess,
Yep.
Mhm.
right? Because
That
there's-
is such a profoundly correct example. That is like the perfect example of what the conflict he's talking about, where it's like in our world, in our fallen world, it's these things have not yet come together, right? They haven't yet been brought together. We're still struggling to bring them together. And the pain that is around that and the complexities and the unintended consequences that result no matter what direction we go is a perfect example of that difficulty.
Yeah, like it just makes me think about George MacDonald's justice sermon, right? Where he talks about mercy and justice being one, and that we divide them into two. But God is one. So if he is merciful and he is just, then those two things are the same. And this seems to be that what Tomberg's talking about when he says that they embrace each other, right? That they become one.
Yes.
Right? But we live in this world of double truth. So what also comes to my mind is, I've been thinking about this lately, is, you have people who in the world have perhaps like deeply profound spiritual insight, and yet they have a physical existence in the world that is troubling, right? Like morally speaking, right? It's like, yeah, I don't know if I want to.
Yeah, that's the case with Shuan is like that, right? Like Shuan was like a pervert.
Who's that?
And yet he's a great metaphysician.
Oh, okay. Yeah, there's a lot of that there, like I've used simple examples, and I won't get into it, but and then there's more profound examples, but that seems to also be where this double truth trickles in, right? Where people
that double truth is the thing that this is, I think, is when Luke talks about the divided man all the time. This is what he's talking about.
I don't know.
This separation.
I think Luke's more referring to I don't know if he would call someone who has profound spiritual insight but a morally questionable life divided in for him.
No, I mean, no, that's not what I meant. Let me make myself clear. This what he's talking about is the reality of this double truth for us.
Yeah,
That's what he's talking about.
Yeah.
And I think what Luke is trying to say when he says that when he's talking about the idea of the divided man, he's saying they're not actually two.
Yeah.
That if you're looking at it with the right eyes, that those brothers are already united in embrace.
Well, just across the page, he says, according to St. Martin, the quaternary, with respect to the binary, we refer you to letter 2, is therefore absolutely evil, right? If you want to keep the things divided, like the number 2 to Saint Martin was absolutely evil because it
Dualism.
When separated from the decade, from the unity of the decade.
Right, it's not caught up in unity, right? We have dualism, but we have to catch it up in unity. And if we do it as 2, then that's absolute evil because it's diabolos, right? It's divided.
But Tomberg seems to be suggesting that we are kind of stuck with this division in our age.
Well, but I think that the only solution, I mean, what I gathered from what he was saying is that it has to be caught up in the unity. I don't know if I have an example underlined here, but.
Well, he does, actually, he points toward that unity, not necessarily, like, I think the only unity that I think he's pointing toward is what can happen for you internally, internally, spiritually, by following the right path. And that he hints at that toward the end when he talks about like the movement from cross to pentagram to hexagram.
Yeah, that's when he says the War of the Two Roses. Personal arbitrary magic and personal sacred magic.
Yeah, here's the part I was talking about. So this is toward the end. This is page 118. The cross is the vow of virtue and obedience, i.e. the sign and formula of faith. As horizontal human respiration and vertical divine respiration united together. The pentagram is initiative. It is effort and work, i.e. the vow and virtue of poverty, or the sign and formula of hope, as the effect of the presence of divine light here below. The hexagram is the vow and virtue of chastity, i.e. the sign and formula of love, as the unity of Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, and Mother, Daughter, and Holy Soul. The spiritual history of mankind is the way from cross to the pentagram, and from the pentagram to the hexagram, i.e. the school of obedience, poverty, and chastity. And it is at the same time the divine magical operation where love is attained through faith by means of hope. So I think that's where the unity occurs. Like that's how you bring those things together.
And he gets into that, especially in the 19th chapter, 19th letter,
Right.
where he really gets going on the Mother, Daughter, and the Holy Soul.
Yeah.
And that's what's missing. That's why I wrote.
Yes, I know. That's why I wanted to get to that part, especially with you in the conversation today, because like that, and which is why I think that he is like it's the marriage of spirit and soul that he's talking about. Which is why I brought up that when we were talking about the gendered typology stuff, that's why I pointed to the fact that it wasn't to like make excuses or to be politically correct. It was to point out that those typologies exist within each of us.
Right.
In this
And
form,
he admits that, right? Because that's part of his interest in Jung, right?
Right.
And then, but increasingly as this book goes on, it becomes more and more sociological, even though it's present from the beginning.
Right.
And that's why he kind of drops that little hint of the Mother, Daughter, and the Holy Soul right here, which you're like, what? The first time you read it, what? I never, what? Where'd that come from?
That wasn't my reaction. My reaction was yes.
But
of course.
But when people first read it, like, what the heck is?
Yeah, I know.
That's not my catechism.
Yeah.
Right? But it kind of grows as the book moves along, this sociological insight, and it hits kind of full stride in the letter on Force, and then again in the letter on the Sun.
Yeah.
And part of what his whole project is that's what's needed to heal the church.
Right. Yes, absolutely. I totally agree. And I just really quick, I know you're short on time. I just want to ask you this last question before we could recording is like, why is it that you think it was like, so why is it that you think that this book actually like found reception amongst certain Catholic thinkers? Like, why does this book actually have endorsements from,
From those guys?
People from holy orders? I mean, the afterword is written by a cardinal, von Balthasar. So it's like, why, what is it about? What is about?
My thought is it's totally grounded in medieval Catholic cosmology, but extended.
Right.
That's what I think, because the whole thing with the magic stuff, it's Renaissance Catholicism.
Yeah, I know. I was listening to Alexander Dugan lecture the other day, and he made this claim that like the West doesn't have any real metaphysics, essentially, right? Other than
the Orthodox like to talk about Catholics, yeah.
Right. I know. It's like he should read Tomberg. I mean, that was like if you don't think Catholics have metaphysics, then read Tomberg.
Yeah.
That was, yeah.
And that's
So,
what and in fact, we talked about that in my course I gave the weekend. The first lecture I gave was just about, kind of a cosmological situation, right? How we are and how the church year is,
right.
how it starts there.
Yeah.
You want to know how to turn gardening or farming into a sacred act, start there.
Yeah, absolutely.
But and so I think those people who know the tradition, like who's on the back here, Balthazar Schlepper, Joachim Illies, Basil Pennington, others as well. But when this book came out, very few Catholic sources reviewed it.
Yeah, Thomas Keating endorses it on the back of mine too. I mean, that's like,
but those guys knew the tradition, and so when I read it as a 23-year-old or whatever it was, had gone through 100 years of Catholic schooling. When I read it, I thought, wow, I can be in a church like this.
You're right. Yeah.
Because I had kind of I had totally left the Catholic Church at the age of 18.
Right.
And it made me rethink what it means to be Catholic. And which actually explode and over the intervening years has kind of exploded that idea of being Catholic to the original subtitle of the Submerged Reality. In fact, it had something about ecumenism in it. And as you can tell if you read the book, that as far as I'm concerned, the Catholic tradition is the Roman Catholic, Orthodox, Anglican tradition.
It's all the traditional.
That's the sacramental tradition.
Sacramental traditions. Yeah, I'm with you on that. That's why I'm practicing as an Anglican in good conscience.
Yeah, when we do house church, we use the Book of Common Prayer for house church.
Yeah.
Because it's beautiful.
I actually just got a new prayer book that's really great. It's called the St. Gregory prayer book.
Mm-hmm.
And it's actually a Catholic prayer book, but it's like it has tons of stuff from older versions of the Book of Common Prayer in it.
There's another cool book you might want to check out. Little endorsement here. Celtic Spirituality by Paulus Press. Do you know that one?
No, I'll have to check it out.
Which it's got all these prayers from the ancient Welsh and the Irish.
Yeah, I do have a copy of Carmina Gadelica, which is also a great collection of like old Celtic prayers.
Yeah, I got that too. Yeah.
Yeah.
But this has got more liturgical stuff in it, which is fun.
Awesome.
Yeah. Anyway, so I should probably go do some farming.
Thanks for joining us today, Michael. I think
my pleasure.
This is as good a place as any to end our conversation. Thank you.